Hello there, I'm the serial plagiarist, and today I wanted to discuss the ins and outs of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. This game was basically the brainchild of the Todd Howard. Known for over-promoting all of Bethesda's RPGs, 200 endings for Fallout 3, Radiant AI in Oblivion, 16 times the detail for Fallout 70 shit.
Tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies.
Yeah, this is the reason this game exists at all, is because our very own sweet little liar decided to dip his toes into the Indiana Jones universe, conceptualizing a story taking place between Raiders and Last Crusade, and KKK agreed to it. Now, when it comes to the studio put up to the task, MachineGames wasn't actually a bad choice in my opinion. I don't know how much I've spoken about it, but I was obsessed with the Wolfenstein games that they made. The as-of-yet incomplete story of American war hero B.J. Blazkowicz waking up in a world where the Nazis won World War II and enforced their will on the world, and you as a one-man army have got to undo that. I remember playing the Old Blood and thinking how similar it was to Indiana Jones, with a few notable differences. So when I heard that they, of all studios, would make an Indiana Jones game, I was optimistic. But then the Diarrhea of Destiny came out, and it was one of the worst things I've ever seen. This was the first part of Indy content in over a decade. Before then, we got literally nothing. And the film, on top of being unoriginal as hell, also shattered the overarching story beyond belief. It was a horrid first entry into Disney's Indiana Jones. I should also mention that aside from that, we haven't gotten any Indiana Jones content aside from the game we're about to talk about today. In the 13 years since Disney acquired Lucasfilm, we've only got 2 pieces of Indiana Jones content. That's pathetic. And between the two of them, it's neither quality nor quantity. Especially since Diarrhea of Destiny drags whatever merit Great Circle has down to the cesspit of garbage. As more and more of the game was revealed though, the more I was wondering how well the game would actually fare. While MachineGames was a natural choice based on their resume of making extremely anti-fascist art, and Wolfenstein having a lot of the wackiness Indiana Jones has, even if it's a more violent version of it, I really did not like the idea that the Great Circle seemed to be too similar in relation to Wolfenstein. Case in point, the first-person gameplay. I don't know why I'm surprised, but I was kind of expecting a third-person game, as literally every other Indiana Jones game was third-person, and aside from Fate of Atlantis, they were all third-person action-adventure games. But for some reason, Great Circle would be a first-person game, and that looked really awkward. They tried selling it as an opportunity to feel like Indiana Jones, but let's be real. The true reason it's first-person is because that's what MachineGames was experienced with. But this isn't the kind of game where you can just cut through and brutalize Nazis like paper mache. The kills in Wolfenstein 2 were brutal and satisfying, but Indiana Jones is the kind of guy who would whack the Nazis, not snap their necks or cut them in half. I should say firsthand that they obviously made better adjustments to fit Indiana Jones better, but there was still something about this game that felt off. Diarrhea of Destiny had the after effect of making me exhausted and sick of the Nazis as the bad guys, especially since Disney doesn't even know how to write them effectively. And unfortunately, that means it reflected badly on the Nazis in this game. Like, obviously they just wanted to use the Nazis because they're recognizable, but as I said in my review of the shit-ass Diarrhea of Destiny, if you don't innovate or try something new, your franchise isn't gonna go anywhere. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle just seemed to be another repetitive Nazi-busting adventure with a MacGuffin that was probably already done elsewhere. And oh boy, am I not wrong. But we'll get to that later. There's 2 other things I want to talk about before we get into the game itself. First, I cringed when I saw them say that this would be Indiana Jones for a modern audience, because I was sweating like crazy when they said that. Second, why does this game have such a generic title? The Great Circle. That's pathetic. That name is far less inventive than even the Diarrhea of Destiny. It also doesn't sound like an actual Indiana Jones adventure. So thus far, Disney is terrible at naming Indiana Jones stories, and surely they could have come up with a far more exciting name than the Great Circle. Like, I think adding something like Legend or Mystery or something before the Great Circle would have done wonders. Terrible name aside though, I think it's time we get into the contents of the game itself. Now, to be honest, I was vastly underwhelmed the first time through. I completed the main story and then scoffed at how bored I was. Then I decided to play it a second time and try to do more exploring and completing quests, and what do you know, the game vastly improved in enjoyability. So I think I made the mistake of trying to get through the main story without trying to indulge in side quests, which would make the whole experience better. That's a note to myself in case they make a sequel, but for a first time player, knowing what already happens, this knocked the game back for me. The realization that I would have enjoyed it more if I didn't just focus on the main quest. Hopefully I'll try to answer the question of why the game sucked the first time I played it before it grew on me. But for now, let's discuss the game beginning to end and see how it fares. Now, despite the game growing on me immensely the second time, there's still parts of it I don't like. And the intro sure as shit is one of them. They use the intro to Raiders as the tutorial stage, and while it's cool how they replicated the prologue to Raiders in game form, I think I would have preferred an intro that revolved around a different mini-adventure. It mostly just came across like a cheap attempt to convince us that the developers just love Indiana Jones so much, to the point that they'd recreate the famous intro sequence from the first movie. But it comes off as manipulative because most of it doesn't relate to the game's story very much. Now, Raiders itself, aside from setting up Belloc, doesn't actually have much relevance to the Ark of the Covenant, but it served as an introduction to the character, and marking what kind of movie it was going to be. That was the value of the Raiders intro. But when it comes to the Great Circle, with it trying to be a direct sequel to Raiders, even more so than Last Crusade, the whole thing it's trying to be a follow-up to is Indy and Marion separating again. Despite the intro of Raiders having next to nothing to do with Marion, they used that as the intro, and threw in a bunch of voiceover flashbacks of Marion berating Indy over their relationship. And then the game and its story actually starts. And look, maybe I'm just missing something, but there's really something I resent in the game not coming up with its own mini-adventure before it begins. Like, even Diarrhea of Destiny had a prologue that was a follow-up to an unseen adventure. Raiders had the Fertility Idol, Temple of Doom had the Peacock's Eye, Last Crusade had the Cross of Coronado, and Kingdom of the Crystal Skull had that shit that Indy and Mac were digging up for, and also the alien from the Roswell incident. I don't know. I feel like in general, I thought the intro imitation of Raiders was nostalgia bait more than anything. When it comes to the experience itself, it was a better experience watching the movie than it was playing a game version of it. I've heard the complaint that the sequence is linear and won't let you go to any areas that Indy himself didn't go through in the film. But I feel that's a stupid complaint, because I don't think the tutorial even emphasizes exploration like the rest of the game does, and obviously it's not going to break the film canon. It does break canon in other regards, but we'll get to that later. So point is, even with my renewed opinion on the second playthrough, the intro wasn't very impressive. Okay, so let's get on with the actual adventure. Basically, it starts with Indy and Marcus Brody fast asleep at night in Marshall College. I presume after overworking themselves. It's a dark and stormy night, and because it was spoiled in the trailer, there's a huge noise nearby, indicating that someone has broken in. Indy proceeds to get up at the disturbance, and, I was underwhelmed too. Now, maybe it's because I played this game on the much weaker Xbox Series S, but despite the game trying its hardest, the atmosphere doesn't feel quite right, at least when playing the game. Maybe it's because they already spoiled it in the trailer, so you know exactly what to expect. But walking through the Marshall College, it feels so generic, especially with Indy saying someone's gonna get expelled tonight, which is like one of the most cliche sounding lines of dialogue I've ever heard in a situation like this, and it's said in the exact same way. I should also mention that my experience with playing this segment and watching it was totally different. By watching it, I meant I was going over the footage I had already captured, and for some reason, it was more interesting to watch this footage like a movie than it was to play it. That's really odd, but it's true. I have to wonder if I had played this on a Series X, a normal PlayStation 5, or a beefy PC would have done the job better than if I played on the worst option. Keep in mind too, that I own a 1080p TV. not a 4K one. So whatever this game wanted to achieve, I was doing it on the weakest possible hardware. But anyways, I was underwhelmed at this intro, but it's not like I hated it, I just kind of had a deadpan reaction. The first time I played this game, that was sort of the vibe. That's why I initially called it Indiana Jones in the generic circle. I think this game is full of shit we've already seen before and it's being recycled. And I think it's why I was underwhelmed by the story the first time, because I probably knew where it was going. I suppose since the intro failed to sell me on the game in the first couple of minutes, the game was struggling to pick up once the new story actually started. That, and playing it on weaker hardware, and already having seen the trailers, it was the worst possible combination. Okay, so with that being said, you navigate across Marshall College, and you come across this guy, who is basically the Pat Roach of the story, except of course, he's black. A giant who the game teaches you to have a fist fight with, and to be honest, the combat is probably one of the most awkward parts of this game. The game is meant to be a brawler more so than a shooter, because this is Indiana Jones we're talking about. But the first person perspective makes it really strange. There's dodging and blocking, but I kind of struggled to remember half the time that the dodge button existed. Because by default it's marked as A on the Xbox controller, and you're supposed to move in a specific direction with the thumbstick. The controls feel really weird here. I think the button placement is awkward for starters, and it really feels like the developers who at this point were used to making a shooter game specifically, really had to readjust their game-making design for Indiana Jones. A lot of the time, there'd be a lot of enemies alerted to your presence, because I didn't have the patience to be stealthy, and I'd be forced to duck in a corner and face them all one by one. I will say that the whip is really handy at disarming enemies, and it's actually pretty fun because their weapons will propel towards you, to where you can pick it up and whack and shoot them with it. And ironically, when you've got to fend off like 50 guys because you were too lazy to be stealthy, it's actually kind of fun to mow them all down. Then I remembered that's what the Wolfenstein Games sort of did, with you being a one-man army, and I started to realize that this game's strengths seem to be more when it's imitating the game series, more so than trying to be Indiana Jones-esque. Because the Wolfenstein-based elements are great, but since they're trying to make an Indiana Jones game, it's scaled back. Like, I think it's actually kind of fun and challenging, the fact that weapons this time around have limited ammo, and so when there's again 50 guys trying to kill you, you have to be a good shot. The downside is that headshots do not automatically result in a one-hit death, which is stupid, I think, and so it makes the game far less rewarding for you to be more accurate with your guns. The gunplay is no Wolfenstein, as it seems the gun is made to be the last priority rather than your first. I should also say in regards to stealth, I have a mixed opinion on it. Being a first-person game means that it's probably as challenging as Wolfenstein, but takedowns for the most part are a lot harder. Because until you collect a skill book that allowed for unarmed takedowns, you're supposed to grab equipment and tools meant for takedowns, like a shovel and a hammer. Similar to The Last of Us, they all have a durability bar, and I thought it was actually a good design decision, that you were forced to find and swap out melee takedown weapons, but they made them plentiful enough that they aren't scarce. I think there's an issue, however, in the fact that the takedowns aren't as simple as Wolfenstein. In Wolfenstein 2, for example, you press the takedown button and BJ does lethal bodily harm to his enemies in a short animation. But in Great Circle, for some reason you have to be positioned properly. And also their backs have to be turned. I don't know why you can't whack them in front, but that's how it works. It was very dumb having to stop in my tracks to position myself, so that it would result in a takedown rather than a simple whack that would only deplete one bar on the durability of whatever I was using, and the enemy would still be conscious. And the whole area would be alerted to my presence, and I think that happened far more because of the flawed design. Like, this whole game kind of feels roughly patched over Wolfenstein in general. And that's not to say that you can't have fun with it. It's just that there's stuff about this game that feels like it's trying to overwrite a different game series and trying to make changes. Like, obviously, an Indiana Jones game where it does nothing but shoot with the occasional melee takedown or whip thrown wouldn't feel like Indiana Jones. Like, I mean, if it was more like young Indy, where there was a lot of World War I combat, It might, but this is meant to be an imitation of the movies first and foremost. So those were my general thoughts on the combat and stealth. It's decent if I had to describe it in one word, but very open to improvement to say the least. Anyhow, I thought I'd describe some of the gameplay first. Let's get back to what we were doing. Fighting the unnamed giant, who was speaking in Latin before we interrupted him. The game teaches us the fighting controls I just mentioned, and so you have a little fist fight with him. Although you cannot beat him, as after you do enough damage, the stranger has you at a chokehold, and despite Indy's best efforts to resist, the giant knocks Indy out and escapes. The next morning, Marcus Brody wakes Indy up from the same spot he was knocked out, and Indy remarks what he saw. A giant with dark skin and scarring broke into Brody's museum and ransacked the place. So after this, Indy deduces what they need to figure out what the giant took, and we are given control to put some stuff back to figure out what the giant was in here for. You go around, placing stuff back in their proper place, and we as Indy discover that the giant, out of everything, stole a cat mummy from an expedition from Siwa, Egypt. Now, finding out what the thief stole is completely fine, but the next part that makes no sense whatsoever, after navigating the college for a while, collecting stuff, which, trust me, you're going to need to do to unlock new abilities because even collecting crap gives you adventure points, you end up discovering where the giant broke in and out of. A window really high up to break into the college. Now, after Indy and Marcus carry a bookcase up to its proper position, Indy climbs up and discovers a pendant that the giant left behind. And already we've got a convenience in the writing. While you can assume the giant left this behind in a hurry, there wasn't much of a priority to leave in a hurry, given Indy was knocked out cold. But I think it's very odd that the giant would just conveniently leave behind a pendant. That looks very important too, and is actually used in the main story to unlock doors behind by accident. It's very clumsy if anything, and I didn't actually realize how easy they made things for the good guys here the first time I played this. Only under an analytical eye do I realize how silly this is, especially since the giant throughout the story is portrayed as a tough, no-nonsense brute, more or less. Also, in case you're watching this review and don't intend to play the game itself, no, the giant didn't want to be followed. They also quickly figure out that the symbol on the pendant is that of the Vatican's secret archive in Italy. So Indy immediately wants to get to the bottom of this mystery by heading straight to Rome and collects his suitcase to dress up in the iconic jacket and hat. Although this is the first setup to one of the overarching elements of the story, the fact that he and Marion separated a year ago, and Indy deliberately states that he hadn't opened the suitcase for a year, when Marcus points out there's a journal in there wrapped in a gift bow. I also have to say that so far, this game doesn't come across as very subtle. This in regards to the intro being a clear callback to Raiders, the super obvious mystery sprung from the giant's break-in, and the fact that you can immediately tell where this scene is going, as Marion left him this journal before they separated. As far as we know from Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, their separation did not happen peacefully. And well, I suppose there's a bit of consistency for presenting said event as not happy at all, as Indy discards the note Marion gave him in the journal, and doesn't tell Marcus who the journal is from, although Marcus does mention Marion anyways. You know, I gotta be honest, this story, at least from what I observed, doesn't seem to explore the immediate aftermath of the separation between Indy and Marion much. Crystal Skull gave the aftermath of the past 20 or so years far more attention, actually. And I actually forgot half the time this was supposed to be a reflection of the ending of Raiders, until Indy brings it up directly again later on. I think the dialogue when it comes to Marion is so obvious, and there's a lack of subtlety, as the player as Indy packs his stuff to a trip to Italy. I also thought watching the cutscenes looking back at the footage was also more compelling than playing the game with the controller in your hands. At this point of writing the review, maybe The Great Circle would have been better as a motion captured 3D animated movie rather than a video game. I mean, why not? But anyways, Marcus seems to catch on to the fact that Indy is trying to escape from the bad memory that was his breakup with Marion. And as he says in the trailer, he can't just run away from his problems. although Indy dismisses that, and thus the adventure begins. Okay, so far, I've been talking a lot of smack about this game, but it's actually around the Vatican, and the ability to freely explore is where the game picks up. I suppose I can tolerate a game if it has a shaky intro, but manages to pick up after that. A lot of stories can do that and still be awesome. And I wouldn't exactly say that the Great Circle is awesome after this, but it does get good. But first, turns out that we're not allowed to enter Vatican City. And one of Indy's old friends warned him that it's not safe over typewriter. And when we arrive to Rome, we gotta get through the Castel Sant'Angelo. Now, having played Assassin's Creed, or at least the first 7 or 8 games extensively before it was run into the ground with the RPG titles, I liked Indy's take on the Vatican and its surrounding areas. Indy breaks into the Vatican in his iconic jacket and hat, and it's here where I will give mild props. At least the Nazis aren't the only bad guys in this game. The fascist Italians and the Imperial Japanese later do serve as secondary antagonists. But there is a thing where the Italian black shirts do sort of blend in with the Nazis, not gonna lie. This is our first real taste of stealth, as we have to navigate and sneak past the black shirts, and if need be, knock the spaghetti out of them. I went out of my way this time to explore around. One of the complaints I have about this game are how certain animations are slow, where it gets to the point where it gets annoying when I have to watch it play out. One such issue is climbing. Indy's climbing is really slow, and while it's probably how much time it realistically takes to climb like that, it's a detriment to my patience. For context, I am a very impatient player. I sometimes kind of want to rush through areas as quickly as possible, and while it's probably my fault, I really resented the climbing animations for taking its sweet time. The fact that Indy has to grip his way up with the whip, all before he reaches the top, puts his whip back, and slowly climbs up, yeah, I kind of got frustrated with that. Red Dead Redemption 2 had most of everything happen in real time as well, but I certainly wasn't having much adventure when Indy was taking a while to get up a building, or a ledge, or whatever. I guess it's very nitpicky, but I kind of got sick of it when it happened over and over again. Like for real, especially when I was in the post-game and wanted to collect all the bullshit I missed. So to summarize this part, I went around whacking black shirts. There's a moderate amount of climbing, and even a part where you navigate down a zip line. Before you meet up with Indy's friend, Antonio, who the game alludes Indy knows from their mutual service together in World War I, because Antonio refers to Indy by his cover name, Henry, as in Henry Defense, his given name in the Belgian army. Well, I did appreciate that attention to detail, and the fact that anyone who didn't watch young Indy would assume that this was just Antonio calling Indy by an Italian version of his father's shared name, but done in a way where anyone who didn't watch the show is still caught on the same track. It's only alluded to the fact that Indy and Antonio know each other from mutual service in World War I 20 or so years prior. I have wondered if we could get a proper game version of World War I Indy, complete with Remy coming back, and maybe throwing a supernatural element into it. I do think they would have to spend some time explaining to the average gamer why Indy is in the Belgian army and fighting in World War I, but besides that, I think there's a lot of potential there to renew interest in young Indy, but that's me spitballing. Anyways, in the game that we do get, Antonio and Indy haven't seen each other for 19 years. And as I said, they allude to their time in the Great War. Antonio is an older man, and in fact requires a full-blown hearing aid, I presume, because of loud artillery. I will give the game props. He is as believable as an old friend of Indy as anyone else in a competent Indiana Jones story does. Plus, at least the writers actually bothered to do their homework. So I'll give them some credit. Their interaction between each other feels genuine, and that they know each other from old times. And on top of that, the fact that Antonio seems to have been on a long journey off screen makes this character feel lived in. Antonio is introduced to us as one of Indy's old buddies from Italy during World War I. He would have been off screen during the episode concerning Northern Italy in 1918. I also say that he feels lived in because the game establishes that he's been through a lot in so little dialogue. The fact that he served with Indy, almost went deaf, was mentally scarred by the war, and became a priest in the Catholic Church as a way of coping with the PTSD. And he mentions how terrible the war was when speaking to Indy. This is the kind of character I want to see in the future, and out of all the characters, in the main story at least, he seems to be the one with the most depth. I suppose he has an advantage over other characters that he personally knows Indy prior to the events of this story, and so they can do callbacks easier than other characters. But even with that said, Antonio comes off as a likable sidekick to Indy. Even if he isn't really a sidekick, given he plays a supporting role in this game at best, and doesn't tag along for the other locations. Even the fact that Indy gives him a gift in the form of the 1930s version of a jazz CD, which may or may not be a reference to Mysteries of the Blues, which was all about jazz, it makes Antonio cry with happiness, and honestly it feels very humble actually. None of it feels phoned in or fake. And while it's a small part of the story, it establishes quite well that Antonio is a vibrant character full of history, and potentially a character they could use if they decide to reboot young Indy. I don't expect a young Indy reboot to be any good in the hands of Disney, but still. I should also mention to anyone unfamiliar with my channel that I have the belief, based on how Disney operates, that the only thing that has the possibility of being good are the video games, due to Disney's disinterest in the gaming industry, and how they seem to be more lax when it comes to video games, meaning that there's actually an opportunity for them to be good, although it's a double-edged sword. Anyways, the scene transitions to where Indy has been in Antonio's office during the night, as Antonio himself jams off to the jazz. So with that being said, Indy and Antonio then discuss the missing cat mummy, as Indy states that he's been looking for a tall giant, who left behind a calling card in the form of a Vatican City pendant. He gives Antonio the pendant when he asks, and he of course recognizes the symbol, but he can smell danger from far away, because he asks Indy whether he really wants to investigate this, which I also like, because it shows him as a concerned friend looking out for his buddy. And Indy affirms that he does, because he's not just about to let the giant off the hook, having taken all the time to travel to Italy after all. Antonio does mention that one of his old colleagues, who was mentally insane, did talk about giants dating back to the 16th century. But aside from that, he gives Indy some attire to blend in, a priest's uniform, and that's where we get access to the clerical suit, the first of many disguises one can acquire throughout the game. And while Antonio warns Indy that Italy's current leader, we'll get to him soon, has eyes and ears everywhere, this is where we're introduced to this guy, Father Ventura, who appears behind Antonio. Indy says that he's Father Gallagher from the church in Boston, and immediately Ventura looks at him with suspicion and tells Antonio that Indy, posing as Father Gallagher, is his responsibility, before walking out. And with that, we're free to explore the Vatican. Our first priority is to go to a certain back room in the library, and then find a certain spot, and use the pendant to unlock a secret area. So with Antonio, you venture through the secret area. A key component of exploring is usually navigating dark spaces with a light source, in this case a candle this early on into the game. While it's pretty atmospheric for exploring new areas, by the time I beat the game and I was just navigating through the same areas, trying to reach collectibles for the secret ending, the darkness just felt annoying. I suppose it is worth noting that it's the same kind of feeling I got waiting for Indy to climb his fat ass up buildings or platforms. Case in point, it was annoying. You see, you're forced to deliberately raise the light in front of you to see better. And I suppose all of this is just a pet peeve of mine. As I said, the first time, it's actually fine, but for the most part, it's annoying. So we navigate the depths of the secret area, restoring light to this area long forgotten, and when we come across a locked gate, Indy opts to swim underneath a hole in the ground to get to the area. Another pet peeve of mine is how slow Indy swims in general, and believe me, swimming becomes an important part of the game in one of the locations after this one, but I'll talk about that later. It's not too bad in the Vatican, because the Vatican's not really known for being water-based. Try Venice if you want that in Italy, and believe you me, that's a blessing. Anyways, turns out the mad priest Antonio was talking about died here centuries ago, trapped in the dark. But fortunately, he left behind a useful map that can be used for navigating the Vatican. And Antonio lends us a clerical key. used to go to places only priests are allowed. Indy realizes that he must capture different symbols around the Vatican, but since he doesn't have a camera, Antonio tells him that he'll find one at the post office, as it's being sold out of the lost and found section. So yeah, with that, we're free to explore the Vatican. This isn't explicitly open world, more like open areas, and the navigation was often confusing, and I hated the fact that whenever you got lost, you couldn't just fast travel out of an area. You have to specifically go to a sign in a set destination to fast travel. The thing was, however, that you couldn't just fast travel out of any area, which would have been very useful. If you're stuck in a tomb, you have to find your own way out, and it got really annoying. Since tombs have a confusing layout, the maps you get only tell you so much. I also want to note that when I entered the Holy See of Vatican City, I opted to sneak into a tent, stole some money, got detected immediately, and was forced to run away. However, since Indy is so unfit at this point in the journey, the stamina bar depleted quickly, and I was forced to get into a defensive position and fight the fascist black shirts going after me. So I did. Jesus, the parry and dodge buttons take some time to get used to. If you don't make the mistake I did, you'll be fine, as long as you don't enter an out of bounds area, which I proceeded to do and got caught. Damn, I'm so bad at stealth in these games. I remember the first time I played Assassin's Creed, my brothers tried to tell me stealthy is healthy, but I ignored them because I wanted to be a tough guy. Point is, I probably should have listened to them, especially in a game like this. I should probably also mention this now, but I really didn't like how you couldn't do takedowns on dogs. Like seriously, I'm not expecting the Wolfenstein solution where BJ just opts to slit their throats, but at the very least, I would like to knock out the canines as much as the human enemies. It's really awkward that the only way to fend them off is with the whip. I say this because there was an instance a dog was onto me, and the only way to get it to piss off was to use the whip. So moving on, we go to the post office and meet the guy there, Ernesto. I should mention around this time that the fascists give off this vibe as intrusive bad guys, dicking their noses into the priest's business, with Father Ventura being a willing collaborator, and most of everyone else don't like the black shirts. Now, based on my historical understanding, that's not necessarily wrong when it comes to the Vatican and the fascist regime of the time, but also, I'm pretty sure the fascists were led by a certain dictator, and they didn't allow freedom of speech against the regime. I don't know, it's always been sort of iffy when characters in a story, especially a video game, live in a dictatorship, and they confide in a stranger how they don't like the current government. I know we're in Italy, but it reminds me of the comments I got on a recent video where most Germans pretend everyone in Germany secretly opposed Silly Mustache Man and was a resistance fighter, when the reality is certainly far darker. In a similar vein, it seems like most of the characters in the Vatican who aren't black shirts themselves have negative opinions of the fascist regime. Look, maybe I'm just nitpicking, but I don't like the vibe the game gives off when it comes to the black shirts. And it's a mixed message of, oh, most Italian people are good, and they hate fascism just as much as anyone else does, and the black shirts are a bunch of bad eggs. And it comes off as a very snowflake mentality. I should note, after all, that this is the first Indiana Jones game to leave a disclaimer that they don't want to offend or trivialize the crimes of the Nazis. Blah, blah, blah. So it comes off like they really didn't want to offend people. I wouldn't put it past them in the current climate that MachineGames and Bethesda were terrified of offending Italian players, for example. So instead of giving them a confronting experience on what Italy used to be like, they pussied out and tried to spread the message that nobody liked the fascists except for the fascists, that only the dudes in uniform liked the regime. Yeah, that's just revisionism at best. Every country in the world has dark aspects to it, okay? Deal with it. Anyways, enough with the ranting. Let's discuss the post office. Indy asks the guy there, Ernesto, for a camera that he can use to take pictures. Apparently, Ernesto has a high quality one that can actually take photos with color, which is like a big deal for 1937. However, he remarks that it will cost a lot, so he charges $379 for it, which I suppose isn't chump change for this game, but it's also more affordable if you've been venturing around enough. When I spent my money on it, I more than had enough left over to spend on other crap. The camera itself is an item that you will use a lot, and it's used to take pictures of practically everything noteworthy. And it's actually pretty rewarding to just take a picture and get some adventure points. The stuff you use to gain new abilities through adventure books. So anyways, we go around the area taking pictures of etchings with different symbols via what the mad priest was talking about in the hopes that it will lead us to the cat mummy. After taking the photos, we return to Antonio, in which we deduce all the pictures and find a connection between all of them in relation to Pope Nicholas V's tower, and how we need blood in order to access it, via the inscriptions. And by blood, I actually mean wine. So Antonio readily provides us with a glass bottle of the stuff, and we go straight to the tower and pour the liquid on a mural. And we gain entrance to another secret area, and it leads us to a puzzle to adjust the right numbers to an image of Jesus on the crucifix. Now this puzzle is not hard whatsoever. Basically, you need to go to nearby murals, pour the wine, and you'll get a number that assigns to a certain part of the image of the crucifix. You will need to find your way around to get to some of the murals, but beyond that, it's easy. I guess it wouldn't be fun if Indiana Jones got stuck this early on into the adventure though. Now this is not a criticism of the game whatsoever, but I hate puzzles. It's completely a me thing, but I just can't stand them, because I tend to get stuck. The main criticism I had of Fate of Atlantis was that it was impossible to figure out what to do next. Not without a walkthrough or a vivid imagination, but that's a review for another day. Anyways, we get around to the tomb of a giant, and after trying to open the tomb, turns out the fascists have a bulldozer, and they arrive in the tomb as well. Although obviously just by drilling through the Vatican. Those lazy shits. But through that, Indy approaches the shattered skeleton of the giant and learns where in the Vatican to go next, the Fountain of Confession, as that's what's tied to the Nephilim Order, which you can gather is the order that stole the cat mummy in the first place. This is before the bulldozer completely bursts through the wall, and it's here where we're meant to find a way out, and it's where a bunch of enemies hang around. And most of what I said about stealth stands. Anyways, after finding our way back to the surface, one of the black shirts helps us up, but finds out too late that Indy's not one of them, and it's here where we catch wind of a suspicious woman, a nun, poking around. And so Indy out of curiosity follows her to see where she's going. Yeah, and this is the gal who accompanies Indy through the rest of the adventure. Indy approaches her as Father Gallagher, and while she tries to make the excuse that she was just watching the birds, it's here where an important development occurs. A German airship arrives, and Indy snatches the binoculars off the nun, and observes the arrival of the main antagonist, Dr. Emmerich Voss, German archaeologist, and head of Silly Mustache Man's occult research program. Indy openly states this to the nun, but bluffs that he only knows that because the Lord told him so. Yeah, and so the woman snatches his identification and finds out who he really is. And at the same time, Indy realizes that she's no nun, but instead an investigative reporter. So the woman comes clean that she's a journalist, and she's looking into the disappearance of someone dear to her, who Indy recognizes through the photo she possesses as Dr. Laura Lombardi, one of the world's leading experts into ancient languages. So yeah, this is where the woman states that Laura is her sister, and she introduces herself as Janetta Lombardi. Now another iffy thing to me personally is why Janetta, or Gina as she's nicknamed henceforth, trusts her whole agenda with a random stranger, aka Indy. Especially when he lied about his identity as a priest. Now granted, she lied too about being a nun, but mutually between the both of them, it seems like they just develop an alliance way too quickly. Gina is quick to give Indy a picture of her sister and state the stigma she has against Emmerich Voss. I also say this because Gina later in the story states that her first impression of Indy was that of someone to be met with immediate suspicion. So that's another plot point I find strange. Anyways, Gina proposes that they both mutually help each other with intel on what they are both looking for. And it's around this time that I found a full-on black shirt disguise, which thankfully allows you to sneak past most of everyone, but also allows you entrance into Fascist Fight Club. There isn't much to say about this side quest other than boxing numerous dudes and collecting your winnings when you beat them. I should also say here that this is also where I took side quests more seriously. such as meeting Gina in the Sistine Chapel, and it's here where Gina states that her contact in the Vatican, Juliana, is here to meet her at the museum. But the museum is locked down, so she might be in trouble. And so Indy must help her with her problem concerning her contact. Now, I kind of missed out the first time, but if you go through with this quest, right after Indy and Gina talk, a fascist black shirt taps Indy on the shoulder, and thinking that Indy's a priest, asks for a confession. Because he has sinned. Indy is uncomfortable because he really doesn't want to listen to whatever this guy did to have sinned, and he even tries to bail out before he's confessed, but he's forced to listen to the guy's confession. It's so memorable that I couldn't leave it out of this review. Basically, the guy reveals that he had an affair with his mother-in-law behind his wife's back, but it gets increasingly worse as he goes on. Not only that, but his wife is expecting a child, and on top of that, turns out his mother-in-law might be carrying a child too. Indy's natural reaction, since he isn't a priest, is to go, Jesus Christ, what have you done? And then when the guy realizes he's not a priest, Indy knocks him out and sarcastically quips that he kinda deserved it. Yeah, what a bizarre and fucked up problem this guy found himself in. But it's presented in the most comical shock value way, so it really hurts. The fact that this random character sinned in the most ridiculous way, and I also like how he's characterized to where he loves America, and he specifically wanted an American priest to hear his confession because the dude really knows he fucked up. That and the confession itself, in which Indy, not being a trained priest, revels in disgust at the guy's problem. It's actually one of the highlights of the game. It's so stupid, but at the same time so memorable. It's probably the funniest joke in the whole game. You also got to appreciate how I wondered what the hell happened after Indy knocked the dude out. Like, I don't expect it to be resolved, but it gives the impression that the character having this extremely ridiculous situation that he found himself in also has to solve it on its own, and it's like, good luck, buddy. Your wife is about to have a half-brother who will also happen to be fathered by you. This sort of side quest concerns saving Gina's contact, and she reveals that apparently the Vatican has been spying on Indy since his expedition to Siwa, where Indy found the cat mummy in the first place. Anyways, in the main quest, we go to the Fountain of Confession, and we have to solve a bit of a puzzle to gain access. This is around the time that Gina specifically tags around. Before then, we go investigating, find a key in a chest, and a hand missing from the dragon statue up above. And as soon as we collect the statue claw, that's where Gina sticks around, as she abruptly announces to Indy her presence, which causes him to fall over. Now, early on, Indy says he would prefer to do this alone, but this is basically the point where she joins the adventure for good. So with that being said, we've got to do another puzzle which honestly isn't too hard, and once we complete it, we gain access to another secret area. So we navigate the area with Gina, and to make this area a little bit different, this area seems to be based on heat, and having tests that are more life and death related. For example, there's a bunch of swinging blades in one room that you have to navigate past. This leads us to an area in which we've got to forge 2 keys to unlock a main gate. I went on the right side first, and it led me to a puzzle in which I was required to align some pillars in order to get to the next area. I remember the first time I played this, I was confused, because again, I hate puzzles. But in all honesty, it's not actually that hard, especially when you realize you best use your whip to get around. Aside from that, we managed to forge a gold key and use it to unlock the right half of the gate. Afterwards, we go on the left side to get the second key forged. This half is more in line with the trope of activating something that could potentially kill Indy, and in the process he nearly dies. I say nearly because Indy of course has all the plot armor in the world. He activates a fire trap and has to find himself out of it. Like the last part, however, it isn't very difficult. Basically, you've got to hand a stone tablet to Gina, and then collect said tablet on the other side to successfully escape the fire trap. It's here where my complaint about the slow climbing plays a factor here, because it really feels like Indy is taking his sweet time when his life is on the line. Maybe this is the fastest he can go, but it doesn't help the mood of the sequence, where Indy seems to be going so slow. Either way, we get the second key forged, and it leads to a monastery, in which we get more clues as to the whereabouts of the cat mummy, and it's here where we enter a room where we learn about who stole the cat mummy in the first place. Apparently, via notes left in the room, the Nephilim Order, Nephilim being Hebrew for giant, stole the mummy, with Brother Locus in particular being the thief. So yeah, we now know the name of the late Tony Todd's character. And you know, given his passing, I wanted to dedicate some time to talking about the guy. This guy's final video game role was The Great Circle, and he's notable for his deep, threatening voice, which kind of made him perfect for Locus. But I also recall his work on the Transformers franchise as both the Fallen and Dreadwing in Prime. I know a guy on Discord who met him, and the guy described him as respectful, and given this was months before his death, the man was holding on to an aggressive illness, but still took the time to go to conventions, which is commendable. So yeah, regardless of what you know him for, I was sort of leaning towards the Transformers side of things. His talent for the kind of roles he played is undeniable. RIP. So Gina finds a painting with a secret door behind it, and we get in, just as we hear footsteps of someone approaching. We use the pendant to get into a collection room of different statues, and it's here where we finally find the cat mummy itself. After a brief sequence of looking around the room, however, nothing is ever so simple, as the giant Locus himself pops up, demanding that we put the cat mummy back, and that initiates a fist fight with them, with Locus throwing the first punch. Now, as the second fight against someone far stronger, I do like how the sense of scale is a bit intimidating. You have to take this guy on, but at the same time you get the sense that this guy has a huge advantage over you, and that's what makes it scary to fight. Maybe I wouldn't describe it as scary because it's not a horror game, but it certainly is daunting to take on a guy twice your size. Locus isn't too hard to beat, as Gina assists you by throwing stuff at him to get his back turned so you can land punches. This is clearly meant to be an imitation of the big brute fights, and in that regard, I'll say it's decent. The music pops off a lot more in the movies, but at the same time, they did certainly try to imitate the big fights. In my experience, I tried hitting him over and over again, trying different ways to break his defense, and even resorted to using the whip, which dealt minimal damage, but it was still a step in beating this guy. The distractions from Gina helped a bit, but she also threw them infrequently, which doesn't make sense aside from the game not wanting the fight to be too easy. So I guess that's a little nitpick from a game logic standpoint. Finally though, the giant is knocked out, and Indy and Gina carry him to a secluded spot, just as the bad guys of the story turn up. Yeah, there is a movement where they're almost spotted, but it's here where we get the one and only Benito Fasciolini coerce Father Ventura into letting him into the room. Fasciolini then invites Emmerich Voss in and gives him full access to whatever his German allies need. Father Ventura is greatly concerned about El Duce and Voss just taking whatever they want, remarking that the Pope would murder him if he found out. And in the first of many occasions, Voss openly deduces that if Ventura does not give him what he wants, he will expose his dark little secret to the church. It's subtle, but he knows that Father Ventura enjoys fellatio, aka he likes men. And it's basically scummy coercion to not have his secret revealed to the Vatican, because the Bible says that men aren't supposed to bang other men. Also, as far as my research goes, this is actually the first Indiana Jones character who isn't a historical figure to be gay. Maybe there's an earlier example from a comic book or a novel, but as far as I can tell, this is a first for the franchise. I can say at the very least that it's handled more appropriately than another character in this game, because Father Ventura doesn't announce to the Vatican that he likes penis in the 1930s. I also imagine it's why Indiana Jones didn't go out of its way to have openly gay characters, because the thing is, being in the closet was a thing for a reason. Point is, this is enough to get Ventura to comply with both Fasciolini and Voss, because he really doesn't want to be involved in a gay sex scandal, so he proceeds to give them what they want. Starting off with the cat mummy, which Voss proceeds to break open, and the first of the relics he needs, a stone connected to the titular Great Circle. Voss's henchmen also proceed to break several more artifacts to reveal even more stone relics, all of which are in different colors. The name drop has Indy figure out more about what the bad guys are doing. Ventura is incredibly distraught that the Nazis are just breaking priceless artifacts for the sake of uncovering the stones underneath, remarking that it's taken the Vatican centuries to recover them all, and trying to warn Voss how dangerous it is. It's revealed through exposition that even though they've acquired 13 stones, they only need 4 more. Fasciolini also shakes Voss's hand as he trusts that Italy will benefit from this mutual transaction on whatever Voss plans to do. So my thoughts. I think Fasciolini is well used as a cameo. And they do try to make it feel similar to when Indy came face to face with Silly Mustache Man. I also should note that MachineGames themselves did something similar to this, where they gave Silly Mustache Man a cameo of his own in the new Colossus, and it's played for pure shock value. The fact that he just enters the game, and he's so goddamn mentally insane that he just shoots anyone he suspects of being a Jew, and sometimes not even that. Maybe they just made a terrible impression in front of him. It's a long story if you haven't played the game, but basically, BJ Blazkowicz gets executed by the Nazis and is beheaded, but he survives via a head transplant by his friends, and he's now auditioning to play himself in a propaganda film after his enemies think he's dead. Yeah, it's ridiculous, but that's what happened, and the game thrives on the absurd scenario. Anyways, Indy and Gina decide to board the airship before it departs from Rome, and basically something happens that on a first playthrough reminds you of bitch Helena Shaw, where she manages to sneak through a door, but for some fucked up reason, doesn't keep it open for Indy, and Indy's got to get on the airship the hard way, aka loads of climbing and using the whip, plus evading the bad guys. I suppose I did have the bias that after the fiasco that was Diarrhea of Destiny, I didn't put it past them to make Gina basically the 2.0 version of that, where she basically hijacks the story for no other reason than feminism or something like that. Basically a lack of understanding on who the main character is meant to be. And to be honest, with that perception and expectation in mind, I just assumed that Gina was Indy's lesbian sidekick, as little sense as that makes, and I was studying Gina's actions under a microscope, and this automatically knocked back 50 points in the trust meter. Look, I'm not expecting the main female companion to always be some smoking hot chick, but there's absolutely something way off in regards to how Gina looks. Thankfully, it doesn't end up being some condescending bullshit like bitch Helena, but that movie already having put me in a bad mood, I was sweating bullets with this character. I have to wonder if it's because of the dreadful fifth movie that was the reason I had such apathy towards this game the first time. I was expecting the game to be a lesser but still dreadful disaster, and it ended up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think it's easy to become accustomed to garbage at this rate, especially on the Star Wars side of things, but it's not like there isn't some stuff that passed the quality baseline at the very least. I guess from what I've watched of it, Skeleton Crew is a decent show, but it's also the most pointless. But I have to wonder if that's how it managed to not be terrible. Because Kathleen Kennedy didn't shit all over the project with her terrible ideas. I don't know what exactly happened with The Great Circle. The mind behind this story was Todd Howard. Or at least that's what the trailers and presentations told us. From what I understand, Todd Howard has mostly been a designer for Bethesda Game Studios and not an actual writer. That honor would go to Emil Pagolarulo, or however the fuck you pronounce his name. But the point is, this was a story Todd proposed to Lucasfilm, and they accepted his story. The thing that was very suspicious is, given I used to be very invested in the Fallout games, I didn't really give a shit about Elder Scrolls. I was still cautious when I learned that this game was the brainchild of Todd Howard. But at least as far as I can tell, he didn't tell us any sweet little lies. Sorry about the tangent, but that's just how I felt the first time. But now that it's all in the past, and I played the game a second time, and I knew what to expect, I didn't need to stress all that much, and could be a little more objective. Anyways, climbing up the airship and navigating past the bad guys, Indy is almost stopped by Father Ventura, although it's unironically Locus who kind of comes to the rescue, as he causes a distraction large enough that allows Indy to use his whip to grab onto the airship as it takes off. And after climbing on with the assistance of Gina, it's here where we get an explanation of what the Great Circle even is. Indy uses some of Gina's lipstick to visualize the Earth and draw a circle around it, pointing out that throughout the history of the world, there have been centers of great cultural significance. But if you connect them all in a circle, you get the Great Circle. And there's got to be a correlation between them, for a lack of better words. And of course there is. Almost every Indiana Jones adventure has these artifacts do something, and Indy speculates that the stone must correlate to the Great Circle. and points out that even though the Nazis don't care about history, they do care about power, and the Great Circle may unlock access to great power of some kind. And so Indy is now dedicated to uncovering the mystery before the Nazis do. Because obviously, he doesn't want the bad guys to have access to whatever power the Great Circle holds. Gina obviously cares more about finding her sister than she does about the mystery of the Great Circle, but the two goals do correlate with each other naturally. It's here where we get the two in a sit-down scene, in which Indy points out to Gina that the hairpin she has, the one she used as a lockpick at least twice thus far, is an antique, early 19th century, to where Gina states it was a gift from her sister. Indy finds out about a secret blade that the hairpin has, and Gina alludes to the time she was in prison. Although we don't really learn much about her time in prison, it's just name-dropped. It is reminiscent of the George Lucas trope where he name-drops certain events that we don't see on screen to try and make the world feel lived in. But still, I don't know if the writers have a full-fledged backstory for Gina. Her character so far, she does have allies and friends, but the search for her sister takes full priority over everything else, which is understandable, and she at least isn't a total bitch like bitch Helena was. By the way, I think it's still important to make a comparison between this and Diarrhea of Destiny, because that was the bottom of the barrel as much as the original movies and other content. So anyways, the pair stow away in the airship that travels all the way to Giza over the Mediterranean Sea. Now we're in Egypt, and as we exit the ship, we get to see the relationship between Voss and the secondary antagonist, Victor Gantz. And we see that the two do not get along whatsoever. As soon as Voss arrives, he insults Voss by telling him that he's gotten fatter, and sarcastically suggesting that he had too much Italian pasta. The two then try to assert authority over the other, with Gantz stating that the excavation site is his responsibility, and that he was sent here via request of Silly Mustache Man himself. Voss also mentions that they have a giant in their captivity, and if Gantz fails to extract information from him, he's more than happy to interrogate the giant, before going to a nearby camp to rest. Indy and Gina meanwhile sneak on board a truck, and use it to take them to the main excavation site in Giza. So upon arriving to the main area, Indy and Gina go up a small hill to find a blue tent, as that's apparently where Gina's contact is staying. After pinpointing the coloured tent and fist fighting some Nazis who spotted me, we go through the tent and meet this woman, Dame Nawal, who is basically an acquaintance of Gina's sister. And by that, I mean that she had a lesbian relationship with her sister. This is far less subtle than Father Ventura, and while one can argue that Ventura was certainly in the closet, this is the opposite. Indiana Jones is the kind of guy who accepts people based on character, and not on one's race, gender, or sexuality, but that still doesn't explain why Nawal here reveals during her interactions that she and Laura were romantically involved. It does feel like more revisionism almost, sort of like the tolerance for fascist black shirts in the Vatican. Maybe I am just reading too deep into it, but you'd also think Nawal would be a little more careful about who she revealed she had a gay relationship with. Even if someone like Indy is trustworthy with that sort of information, but as far as the game is concerned, they just met. Anyways, the three of them in the tent figure out that the idol of Ra, within the vicinity, may indeed have one of the stones inside. And as well as that, we get a moment in which we're reminded that Indy hates snakes, because he comes across Nawal's pet snake that she has, and he really struggles with it. Aside from that, we're free to explore the area. This area is a lot more open than the Vatican, and at a lot of points, you'll just run across the desert. In this section of the game, you'll be directly attempting to counteract the Nazis. As in one such example, you discover via the radio that Voss is interested in the Sphinx, or at least finding something inside of it. Now, via the fact that you'll have a better experience by doing side quests, I made sure to wander all around and do the quests. Even if it was a collectathon like collect medicine bottles, because you do get rewards for doing that stuff. Strictly focusing on the main story though, we collect a worker disguise and we have to buy our second tool, which ends up being a lighter, so that we could see through the dark. The lighter is in fact even cheaper than the camera, as it only costs $75. What a bargain. So anyways, we explore the sanctuary. And it's basically what you'd come to expect from something like the Vatican's closed-off areas. And with that comes more puzzles. Now, thankfully, these puzzles aren't difficult either, and once we complete the first one, we come across a whole host of scorpions. Not going to say much here, because I think I already gave off the impression of what navigation in this game is like. It's just that the scenery is different, but functionally, it's basically the same. This all culminates in you finding a golden mask, which of course isn't directly tied to the main thing you're looking for. Compared to the semi-side quests in the Vatican, these feel more like busy work, rather than serving a more relevant purpose. I say this because Gina's contact in the Vatican actually felt like you were doing something important in the quest for the cat mummy, even if it was optional. Here, it's just Indy and Gina find something that doesn't relate to the main quest, and there being a bit of character building at the end. With Gina getting a bit of main character syndrome where she exclaims that it was a good idea bringing Indy along. So anyways, the next stage in the main quest involves Noel pointing us towards a tunnel system underneath Giza that the Nazis have discovered recently. And basically, we sneak in and are instructed to take down the Nazi flag in order to signal a distraction that Noel plans to cause. Thankfully, this ends up being more relevant, as upon sneaking through the compound and taking down the Nazi flag, Noel a split second later causes an explosion to go off, detracting attention away from us. I recognize that trope in video games, diverting attention away, and I recall there was something with an identical setup in one of the Assassin's Creed games. Nothing to criticize or praise here, it's just that I noticed that trope. Anyways, navigating the compound is a nightmare without a disguise. And this took me several attempts and a good 15 minutes to get where I was supposed to go. And since I'm so bad at first-person stealth games, I ended up having to wing it like a Call of Duty campaign and shoot the bad guys who were onto me. Skipping all that, upon entering Voss's office, we get a bunch of stuff to look at. Apparently, part of his psychological manipulation trait, he's been reading a book published by Sigmund Freud that is banned under Silly Mustache Man's regime. Yeah, the dude is a Nazi, but doesn't mind reading banned literature. What a hypocrite. We also learn that apparently a Nazi ship, quote, disappeared off the coast of Peru. Keep that in mind for later. Anyways, after we collect what we need, we proceed to spot Voss entering a nearby building, and so we have to sneak across the camp to spy on Voss and Gantz, arguing with each other over a deceased giant that Gantz tortured to death, trying to extract information from him. Voss berates Gantz for his incompetence, and Gantz proceeds to pull a gun out on Voss. This entire first part of the scene is kind of silly by design, but it presents both antagonists as expressive, and shows us more of the psychological manipulation Voss is known for at this point. And when Gantz throws Voss onto the table and is super close to killing him, the ceiling collapses, and Indy comes face to face with Voss, and Gina manages to grab the gun and hold Voss at gunpoint, allowing Indy to examine the giant. Voss tries to manipulate Indy by deducing that he must have left a woman, and reminding him about his father. At first I questioned how Voss figured all this out, but then I remembered that raiders having taken place the previous year, he must have had some awareness over Marion Ravenwood, and by extension, the Nazis were probably keeping tabs on Henry Jones Sr. You know, I did kind of forget half the time that this game was meant to bridge the gap between two of Indy's main adventures. The game does try to make itself its own adventure while bridging the gap, and I'd say that it does a decent job at it. Aside from the blatant fan service at the start, it actually ties in nicely to other films. And I can say that at least this game had more respect for Crystal Skull than Diarrhea of Destiny. I suppose taking place earlier on in the timeline, there wasn't a lot of room to fuck over the overarching story. So there is that. Look, at this rate, I am probably biased against the game, because it's easy to look at everything coming out in the Disney era with immediate suspicion and caution. But if I had to be brutally honest, aside from some expanded adventures which we'll get to later, they didn't shit all over the legacy of Indiana Jones, for the most part. I guess I was so used to what Diarrhea of Destiny did as the standard bearer for Indy under Disney. Damn, that almost rhymed. I'm a poet and I didn't, yeah, you get the joke. So Indy, through investigation, figures out that the symbolism on the giant through his tattoos is in Adamic, which Indy explains is mythologically the first language God gave man in general. We also see Voss plant a seed of doubt into Gina by trying to convince her that her sister was in league with Silly Mustache Man. I don't know if we were supposed to question Voss, but it was kind of easy to deduce that Voss was playing with Gina here. Why? Well, obviously they revealed earlier that Laura wasn't attracted to men, and the Nazis were crazy homophobic even for their time. I mean, after all, they shut down a Jewish sex psychologist because he tried to make the case for the gay community. And decades of progress was lost along with it. I only say this because it's revealed later on that Laura absolutely wasn't a fan of Silly Mustache Man and actively opposed him. And it's played off like it's a revelation. Even though the game wasn't subtle about the fact that Laura wasn't the kind of person who would like the bad guys on principle alone, i.e. the Nazis shutting down gayness before it even got a chance to get off the ground. But we'll get to that later. Point is, Voss tries to plant a seed of doubt into Gina that her sister joined him out of her own free will. I suppose Voss gains a point here because he successfully distracted Indy and Gina. By the time Gantz managed to wake up and ambushes the two from behind and manages to spill the gun on the ground. I actually kind of like the fighting here, where Voss kicks Indy in the face, and during the scuffle, Indy accidentally elbows Voss when trying to land a punch on Gantz, and the characters keep knocking into things that hinder them. This is where Voss in fact has his nose twisted, and Gina narrowly misses a gunshot on Gantz, and Gantz does a full 180 and thanks Voss for saving his life. Until Indy whacks the pair of them. And then, wait, Indy and Gina just leave the room without dealing with Voss and Gantz first? Why not? Yeah, that kind of killed it for me during this whole experience. I suppose Indy isn't the kind of story where you can just have him snap the bad guys' necks. But I mean, like, a gunshot did go off. That would have been the perfect excuse to have reinforcements show up, and have it be more practical to flee the scene, and have the two main bad guys survive in turn. I just hate that trope in general. Letting the bad guys live for no other reason than to not portray the hero as a cold-blooded killer who kills people while they sleep. So anyways, according to Nawal's plan, we escape through a tunnel. This escape is very narrow though, because the exit collapses into itself, and we proceed on with Nawal. As it turns out, Gina has a straight shot to the end of the tunnel, while Indy and Nawal have to find another way out. This basically leads them to an inscription in one of the tombs, in which Indy deduces that the Nephilim order was involved with the ancient Egyptians, long before the Christian church even existed, which leads Indy to his next clue, to go straight to the Sphinx. So yeah, that's where we are to go to next. On the way out, Indy whacks a Nazi, and it's around here where you can find a disguise to trick most of the bad guys in general. With that, we proceed to look at a dream stele by the Sphinx, and figure out where to go next. Basically, east of one of the pyramids. We go to that location, and what do you know? We find the symbol on the giant's tattoo. And thus, it's to exploring another area. We solve a puzzle related to sound, and we activate a trapdoor below. And we solve yet another puzzle related to lights and mirrors. Skipping ahead to the interesting part, we encounter another statue, but we have a boss fight. This time, to a blind giant attracted to sound. I'm going to be real here, this part is quite intimidating, because you start off in complete darkness, and footsteps around certain parts of the floor will get this guy running at you. This is certainly one of the highlights as far as memorable boss fights are concerned. It seems horror game sequences in non-horror games are always the most effective, and that's the kind of stuff I appreciate. And whenever the giant does manage to grab you, when he throws you off, he teleports to a different area to keep the tension high. Man, I hate this. But in a good way. This is also where the first-person perspective actually works at its best. Because since you can't see much of your surroundings, you'll be shitting yourself when footsteps are approaching. So yeah, this part is really solid. And even with the translated subtitles, the guy garbling is really scary. To be fair, it does get a little less intimidating when you turn the lights back on and catch on to what you're supposed to do. But still, I appreciate the segment. Eventually, I took the giant out by pulling out my revolver and shooting him to death. Approaching the body, the giant tells us in his language not to speak their name, in a vague sense, before he succumbs to his wounds and dies, and Indy takes his pendant. It's here where we get another straight shot to another mummy, and we proceed to approach it, break it open, and find another stone relating to the Great Circle. However, the area fills with sand, and we've got to escape. And this is the context for that scene from the trailer, where Indy ends up completely buried in the sand, and Voss and the bad guys show up. And Indy is completely helpless as his body is stuck in the sand. As such, Voss and the other Nazis proceed to laugh at him, and well, we've probably all seen the trailer, but in case you haven't, Voss proceeds to talk down to Indy, telling him that while he was playing his pointless game, he was being played, and that he should have found himself a life of meaning. Now originally, I thought this scene based on what the trailer showed took place in the middle of the desert, but it doesn't. It takes place right outside the excavation site. Voss is informed that a lost party had their distress signal heard in the Himalayas. And despite it being a harsh climb, Gantz volunteers to go there to investigate. And well, yeah, they just leave, with Voss taunting Indy by tossing the hat onto his head. Okay, I would get this if this was in the middle of the desert, but in this location, someone was bound to find him, even if it took hours. If you're going to bury someone in the sand as the villain, at least do so in a secluded area, where they aren't likely to be found, because here, it's just a complete plot contrivance. It's as bad as the "I could kill you, but I want you to see me destroy everything you love" cliche, because it's just a shitty excuse to keep the hero alive. Here it's the same thing. This adventure so far has its highs and lows. And its lows chalk up to massive oversights in the writing, and not having a clever enough way to keep both the good guys and bad guys alive until the very end. Do I have a fix for this? Yeah, make this in the middle of the desert. I originally assumed that the Nazis buried him in this random spot with little to no chance of rescue, but now that I know the story context, Indy basically had an 80% chance of being found within a few hours, and a near universal chance of being found after a day. Especially since Indy's allies would know the general area in which to find him. I don't know how much time passed within the context of the story, but that's how it's resolved too. We get a little gameplay sequence of some damn scorpions swarming Indy, and Indy tries to blow them away. So predictably, since he was left alive and well, Noel and Gina manage to find him, still buried in the sand, and get him out. After he recovers through being given some water, the three of them figure out that one of the stones must be in the Himalayas, mysteriously. So Indy and Gina catch a ride on a ship that Noel has, and this is essentially where she exits the story. And this is around the second time that it's suggested that Indy feels something for Gina. I skipped over it the first time, but basically Noel suggested as such when they were escaping the tunnel earlier in Giza. So basically, Noel says that she'll get some guides to help the pair of them through the cold-ass mountains. And that's where we transition to, as the guide decides to give up on being a guide, and lets the pair go on without him. So yeah, the next part is a navigation sequence. We go across a broken bridge, through an ice cave, and spot a ship that somehow found itself in the middle of the mountain, just on the tip. After we reach the ship itself, we sink into the hull, and basically have to explore from there. Everyone on the ship is frozen to death, and all that's left are letters and notes the crew made before they died. One note I went back to read says that they were panicking as soon as they arrived, and some had different ideas, including trying to abandon their post to find help down the mountain. Eventually, we find out what happened to Gina's sister. We find her corpse, frozen like the rest, and of course, Gina is incredibly distraught at her sister's death. Something awkward about how this is presented though, is that they don't even show us Lara's face. This is mostly a shot of Laura's dead body obscured, and then Gina crying with Indy trying to comfort her before they decide to sit down to grieve. I thought this was really weird the first time I played this, the way it's shot, and it kind of kills how effective this scene could have been, because seeing a frozen face of a terrified Laura or something could have been so powerful, but as it stands, Gina just spots Laura's corpse, grieves, and we don't even get to see her face. And we all know Indiana Jones isn't above showing graphic imagery. So Laura's body is just awkwardly and not directly shown on frame. And it's absolutely noticeable. I don't know what they were scared of, showing everyone else's face, but not Laura's. They're not desecrating the character by doing so. Anyways, with Gina discovering Laura's final fate, and after a while of sitting there to calm down, I presume, she wishes to know what happened exactly, and Indy agrees to help her. It's around this point that Gantz and his team show up, and thus cue the stealth section. Now at this development, I was kind of deadpan the first time. The horror Alora's death isn't as effective as it could be given how it's presented. And I was still kind of on the fence about Gina as a character. It's probably Diarrhea of Destiny's fault, but I was super cautious about even remotely liking a female character that a Disney-era Indiana Jones story introduced ever again. I suppose since I've had time to reflect on it, Gina isn't terrible like Bitch Helena was, and is more likable in fact, but Bitch Helena was such a low bar. With that being said, Gina found her sister, and found some identification of her in some frozen Nazi papers. And now she's questioning whether her sister followed Voss willingly. So anyways, the stealth section is basic. No disguise is present in this area, so we're forced to sneak around. And needless to say, I was really bad at it. Skipping past this section of gameplay, we have to solve a puzzle. And this was actually the first I looked up, because I was too lazy. Not a point against the game, by the way. It's just that, as I said, I don't like puzzles. Puzzles are hard to make fun for me. So in this headcanon, Indy figured out the combination by just guessing. And that's where we find the stone, held onto on a dead body. And yeah, this is another sequence from one of the trailers, where a scuffle happens between one of the Nazis and our duo. It's all just a cutscene, but it's full of that whammy action you'd expect from an Indiana Jones film. Regardless, after beating the Nazi up, Gantz fires a shot in the air to get him to stop, in which he's ordered to put his hand around his head and walk outside. It's here where we get a verbal altercation between Gantz and Indy. Since Gina was not detected, Gantz asks Indy where the stone is, and Indy bluffs that he doesn't know nothing about a stone. That's where Gantz remarks about the German phrase for fear of heights, and threatens to throw him over the mountain, and then starts going on about devotion to the fatherland, while insulting Indy for his nationality. If you've seen the trailer, you know exactly what Gantz does here. I thought it was really cheesy when I saw the trailer, and it isn't improved where Gantz basically insults American beer, and as well as that, cartoons. Keep in mind this was the year Walt Disney made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and it's a movie that Silly Mustache Man was reportedly fond of. It was a German fairy tale after all, and I say this because he'd have a goddamn fit with the remake that came out earlier this year, and not just because there was a Jew in it. I don't know, I just thought I'd bring that up. To be honest, this feels like a scene that was made exactly for a trailer. And I have to wonder if that's the mentality that went into writing it. Because the cutscene is so long, the characters are overly expressive, almost like it's part of a presentation. And I think they were just trying to make a meme out of the whole choo-choo joke. Not to mention Gantz's overly evil German accent. It's the Mad Doctor kind of voice. I do have to say, it is very derivative off of how the Wolfenstein games presented the Nazis, where they have these creepy, overly expressive villains. Take Death's Head, for example. The dude relished in being unapologetically evil, with his creepy demeanor, how he paces out his lines, and that one moment where he literally sniffed one of BJ's allies to see if he was pure enough for dissection. I don't know if it quite fits with Indiana Jones. The villains are certainly whammy, and are memorable for that reason, but this overly taunty scene feels like it comes straight out of the Wolfenstein games. I just thought I'd note it. Still, the scene felt overly silly to me. And I mean, I praised the earlier scene with the black shirt's confession, but this felt like it was trying too hard. Plus, it was the whole Wolfenstein-style writing that I noticed. What can I say? I played the New Order, the Old Blood, and the New Colossus to death. Anyways, when Gantz is about to kill Indy after his whole tirade, Gina reveals herself and offers to give Gantz the stone. And so she walks forward and sneakily pops a live grenade into his hand, which he tosses away, but not before it detonates down below, and the ship begins to lose balance on top of the mountain, and turns into a slide ride at Wet n Wild. There's again a scuffle over the stone as the Nazis keep tripping over, and they throw in the Wilhelm scream for one of them, by the way. So yeah, the amusement park ride goes down the mountain. And since there's no safety protocols, we gotta get the hell off the ride. You can see that in the gameplay here. I was a little slow. I'm kinda like that in segments that require quick thinking. Speaking of quick thinking, when the ship briefly stops, and they're no closer to safety than before, Gina suggests that maybe it was the stone that brought the ship here. And after Indy quotes what the inscription said, he tries to figure out what to do to make the stone transport them elsewhere. Indy reads the stone and realizes that the stone, named the Earth Splitter, must be uttered in Adamic. And so as Indy and Gina are about to plummet to their death, he calls the stone by its name in that language. And that's where the first truly supernatural thing happens in this game. With a portal opening, and both Indy, Gina, and by extension Gantz, who managed to survive, get sucked through it. We cut to Indy waking up in an unknown location, and we see to anyone who recognizes Asian letters that we must be somewhere in Asia. Gantz managed to survive and is about to kill Indy, only to be pierced by glass falling from the ceiling, and that's enough to kill him. Yeah, that's sort of a shallow end to the secondary antagonist. Glass isn't as memorable as all the other horrible ways secondary Indy villains have died, so I'll knock a point against it for that. Although, the game does create intrigue on where the hell we are. Now that one can probably piece together that the stone is a means of teleportation. And we climb up to the top of the building to find out where we are. Shanghai, the largest city in China. And it's being attacked by the Japanese, in the whole prelude to World War II. Basically, just like Pearl Harbor, we get a whole sequence of running and explosions directed by Michael Bay. I will say that it's a neat little set piece, climbing across the bombed out streets of the Chinese city. Watching only the movies, you don't realize that, yeah, this is what happened to Shanghai a mere 2 years after Indy left. It is nice that the stone also didn't land us in somewhere convenient and safe. No. We're in the middle of a war zone. I should also mention that there's not that many enemies in this segment. There's one dude hanging around that you beat up, and there's some collectibles to be seen, but other than that, we proceed to make our way to a docked, intact plane. There is another iffy bit of writing though, where Gina starts flying the plane as soon as Indy yanks the plane up. Jesus, you could have killed him if he didn't have universal plot armor. With that being said, we get a turret section. Yeah, I know it's a video game cliche, but it's not actually that bad. And I suppose it's meant to be a reference to The Last Crusade. With a plentiful amount of ammunition, you as Indy proceed to shoot down Japanese planes trying to take you down. Indy and Gina will also fly past Club Obi-Wan, and Indy will remark about Lao. As the plane loses altitude, Indy decides to grab a new plane. Thus that other part for the trailer where you jump across to steal a Japanese bombing plane, throwing off both the pilots and using it to head to our next location, Sukhothai, located in Thailand. Okay, so I don't have a lot to say about Shanghai, but it's a brief sequence in general, meant for spectacle. And I guess it's meant to keep you on your toes and introduce you with a new problem after finding out about the teleportation device. I will say here that the game is competent when it comes to Shanghai, and it does brush on Shanghai's eventual fate, being bombed by the Japanese prior to World War II. In fact, Gina does remark that another war is coming, and if I had to guess, maybe a sequel they will make will be set during World War II itself. But that's just speculation. Regardless, I'd say that Shanghai is fast and fluent. Not the best the game can offer, but for a set piece of its kind, it does the job. Now by this point, Indy's seen enough that he knows that the Nazis cannot unlock the means of teleportation, and he does offer to drop Gina off at the nearest harbour, but Gina realizes that she's not done yet. And this is where Indy realizes the nearest site on the Great Circle is in Sukhothai. And given none of the relics containing the stones were in that area, that must be where the last stone is. So with that being said, the pair of them decide they're going to Thailand, the country known for transgender prostitutes. Yeah, I saw The Hangover Part 2 recently, get over it. Anyways, they arrive at Sukhothai at night amidst all the rain, and after their long trip, they decide to book it all at a hotel, where Indy decides he'll try to call Marcus after all this time. Upon doing so, Marcus confirms that there are legends about a certain artifact in Sukhothai. Indy is so distracted during the call to Marcus that he doesn't notice when Locus turns up behind him, and when he realizes being confronted, he stares at the giant, who asks him about the stones, although Locus this time shows a new side to him, where he tells Indy not to go hunting for the Great Circle, and in the end, he will be saved. He even says that all life is precious, even his. This is all while Gina has her back turned, so she doesn't spot Lucas as he leaves. And it's here where we shift focus away, as Gina got her and Indy a room. So yeah, this leads to one of those self-reflection scenes. This is where Indy and Gina talk about their feelings, more or less. Indy starts by telling Gina that he's sorry about what happened to her sister, and Gina expresses uncertainty at what she'll do next. Indy remarks that he doesn't know either, given he left Marshall College in the middle of midterms, and he'll have to find a new job. And it's here where he mentions Marion indirectly, remarking how things didn't work out, and he didn't make good on his promises. And Gina responds with what her first impression of Indy was, that he was a heartless grave robber. Indy starts to get flirty essentially, asking her what she thinks now of him. Gina remarks that she was wrong on her gut instinct, that Indy does have a moral compass. However, any chance of a kiss, much less getting laid, are interrupted by an explosion. This is around the time I realized that Gina wasn't a lesbian. Yeah, I really did have the worst fears for this game, that Indy would be cucked by Gina, but surely you can understand why I had such suspicions, right? Diarrhea of Destiny set a really bad first impression, and while I doubt it's going to get much better in general, I have to say that Gina didn't turn out how I expected. While the actress who played Gina is nice looking, for some reason it doesn't apply that well to the character despite using the likeness. Maybe it's the shitty haircut, I don't know. I certainly wouldn't want any woman to have a haircut like that, nor would I want short hair. But aesthetical differences aside, I was watching Gina like a hawk, waiting for her to cuck Indy over, and the game would devolve into a baseless statement about how white males are disgusting, and all that bullshit we've heard a million times before. Ain't nothing wrong with Indy. He's a goddamn multiculturalist, with friends from all over the world. I have gotten complaints that I'm starting to become an anti-woke grifter, but what can I say? I always saw feigned diversity and shallow political allegories for what they were. Thankfully, I can say that Gina mostly has a questionable appearance, but that's not enough to call it woke or even problematic. She's a decent character, I'd say, and she narrowly passes the quality baseline. When it comes to characters in this game, I'd say out of all the new additions, it's either Antonio, who is a short-lived albeit memorable sidekick for Indy, or Lucas, who turns out to be an interesting anti-villain. Anyways, going down the lobby, turns out the local resistance is having a gunfight with the Royal Army. Naturally, Indy and Gina immediately become allies with the resistance and proceed to help them escape. After failing to find a key to exit, Gina instead uses her pin as a lockpick, and uses that to let everyone out, just as the fire starts and the hotel goes ablaze. It's here where we learn that the resistance are fighting those who wish to steal their cultural heritage, and that an admirer of Benito Fascellini made a deal with Emmerich Voss, and thus the Nazis are free to just waltz in and take what they want. The two people of note here in Sukhothai is Palin, the gal with the eye patch, and as we approach the village, we overhear Voss talking to her uncle Sunan, who bluffs and claims that there aren't any rebels in the vicinity. So as Voss leaves, we all get mutually acquainted. Sunan doesn't speak English, so Indy has to communicate with him and translate for Gina. Either way, both Palin and Sunan are hesitant to trust Indy, and Indy does try to insist that he respects their culture and history, and he wants to instead ask their permission to tread on their ground. There's also this part where they fool Indy with a jar that they say holds his greatest fear, although it turns out to be pork intestines, made for soup. We get another legend told by Sunan, talking about the nearby temples, and another mention of the giants, indicating another correlation across the world with this great circle. We also get a name drop of a blessed pearl, which Indy speculates is one of the stones they're looking for, and he shows Sunan the stone, and he recognizes it instantly, and agrees to help the pair find the other stone. Turns out there is a stone through a tunnel in a nearby swamp. Palin and Sunan will acquire a boat for both Indy and Gina, but Indy will also need a breathing device so he doesn't drown. This is the third of the devices Indy will pick up, after the camera and after the lighter. We also learn right afterwards the next morning that Gina can't swim, as she struggles to get on the boat properly. Now when it comes to Sukhothai navigation, it's by far the most confusing of the three main locations. It's annoying how you're supposed to look down on the map every few seconds to figure out if you're even going the right way. This happened more frequently than I'd like. And I'm gonna be honest, half the time, I just abandoned the boat and swam because it was easier. Slower, yes, but it probably saved more time in reality from all the confusing navigation. Given I am a very impatient player on top of that, I greatly disliked how slow the swimming was. Anyways, in most playthroughs, especially the first, you're going to find out the hard way that the breathing device costs a lot of money. So the game has you go to the nearby camp and steal some money so you'll be able to afford the device. Thankfully, the side quest where you steal Voss's gold actually ends up being more than enough. Like 2,000 coins in general, where the device is in the 700 range. So even if you end up taking a detour to afford the breathing device, you'll be rewarded to the point where you can afford other shit. So anyhow, we end up going to the tunnel, and it's here where we gotta solve another puzzle concerning cogwheels. This puzzle is perfectly achievable, so I don't have any complaints here. I hate puzzles, but it's perfectly doable either way. We end up clearing the way for the boat after the puzzle is completed, and this leads us to the main temple. And this is where we get another problem to solve. Basically, a giant snake, bigger than the Komodo dragon in fact, is swimming in the water, and we have to avoid it to make it to the hidden temple. It's that trope in horror games where you gotta look out for something much more powerful than you are to make it out alive. While not as intimidating as the blind giant, this part just gave me goosebumps. It also turns out this was the giant Sinan was talking about. I assumed it would be another large human, but nah, it's a snake. The thing also caught me a few times, so they made the window to escape out in the open tight enough that it feels like a close call whenever you do make it to safety. There's a red circle indicator in the middle of the screen that indicates as much, and thankfully, we make it inside the temple before the snake eats us. After navigating a chasm, we've got another part where we've got to kill the damn snake in a kind of boss battle, where we throw spears at it. After it pisses off, we continue with the chasm navigation. The boss battle itself is pretty simple. Simply throw a spear at the snake before it attacks you. I resorted to spinning round and round just so I could spot the snake before it attacked me. The chasm itself is wonderfully designed from a graphical standpoint. Absolutely the kind of thing that Indy would encounter in one of the movies. I don't know how believable the giant snake is, given, again, it's larger than a Komodo dragon. But aside from that, the navigation is pretty simple, but fun. A big part of the chasm navigation is throwing a spear at a mushroom or something to get it to attach, and then using a whip to go across. It was something demonstrated in the trailers. Anyways, we let Gina up, and we open the gate at the top with two handles twisted at the same time, and we get another puzzle. This puzzle, if I had to describe it, concerns twisting these pointers in the right direction with stones. As you progress in the puzzle, more stones become available, and the more you'll be able to do to get to the end of the puzzle. It's not overly difficult though. This is probably one of the few puzzles I had fun with. I guess it's because it was rewarding, even before you finished it. And getting a new stone lets you know that you were closer to the end than before. It's a good way of letting the player know they're on the right track. It's also relatively short, especially in my second playthrough, so you probably won't get frustrated. Anyways, upon completing the puzzle, Indy and Gina are rewarded with an inscription of an ancient map that tells us where the stone is. Indy is able to identify the coordinates on the map to figure out where the stone is, but of course, nothing's ever that simple, because Locust turns up and he warns us yet again about uncovering the mystery of the Great Circle. Unsurprisingly, Indy whacks Locust in the face, and Gina tries throwing a rock, which ends up collapsing the ground from which Locust is standing, except Indy ends up falling down too. And this is all set up for the next fist fight with Locust. This time happening down below. The boss fight is pretty much the same as last time, except Gina isn't there to help you out. I'm also lucky that I managed to fill my stamina bar this time, so I could keep landing punches. The fight escalates as the giant snake feels the need to join the fun, and it's here where the pair temporarily work together to kill the snake, and Locust is there to finish it off. Now as Indy and Locust proceed to resume their fight, Gina steps in, and tries to make the case that they have a common enemy, and they need to stop fighting each other. Of course, as Locust is busy speaking to Gina about how he must atone for the mistakes of his ancestors, Indy takes this as his cue to knock Locust out. basically ruining the chance for an alliance with the giant. Gina is incredibly annoyed at this, but then just remarks how they should get out of here. This, however, does note a transition for later when it comes to Locus's character. Anyways, we return to Sinan with a picture of the ancient map, and he pinpoints exactly where to go. So it's here where we go to another temple, this time swarmed by the bad guys, who we have to sneak past. At least a few attempts of that later, we enter the temple in question and proceed to do some more navigation. There was also this part I didn't expect, where after we help Gina get up a steep platform, she asks us to throw her a torch. I proceed to do so, but end up hitting her in the face, and believe it or not, she actually reacted to that. I like attention to detail like that the game actually scripted a reaction to the player doing that, and it's one of the few times the game had a reaction to something ultra specific. Anyways, we come across a larger version of the puzzle that we played before, and both Indy and Gina realize that they're going to need more people if they're going to play the game properly. But thankfully, the game doesn't force you to go back and get Sinan and Palin and whoever the fuck else. They just transition to Indy and Gina getting them off screen. So we coordinate all the people with us in order to unlock the door. It's pretty much as simple as the prior puzzle. So I don't have much to say about it. But upon unlocking the door, Indy ventures in alone to collect the stone. There's some water full of leeches that we have to navigate past, and stepping into water is a death sentence. After that, we go down a chasm, and finally we come face to face with the stone, or at least the statue that contains the stone. Pulling the statue out of its position, the whole area starts to shake and we gotta get out of there. The climbing as usual is still a bit slow, even with the skill books I acquired at this point that sped it up a tad bit. But as soon as we run, and Indy narrowly escapes with his life. But as it turns out, Locus managed to catch up and threatens Indy for the stones in his possession, and Indy is forced to give it up, else Locus snaps Gina's neck. However, the two parties aren't out of the woods yet, as Voss turns up, surrounded by Nazi soldiers. This is basically the part where Voss taunts the good guys for doing all the hard work of retrieving the stones for him to use, as he comments on how Indy is a pathetic little man, and taunts Gina over finding her sister in the mountains. He also posthumously shows no respect towards the late Gantz, basically stating that he used him and that he served his purpose. He then tells his men to open fire, and Indy, Gina, and Locus mutually get into cover, spilling the stones in open gunfire. Locus manages to create a barricade from a large stone slab, and tells Indy to grab the stones, all before the three of them attempt to flee from the area. Although Voss and his goons manage to catch up easily, and have the trio cornered. Although, he holds fire after they accidentally shoot two of the Royal Army soldiers, and eventually, Palin and other resistance fighters show up to save the day, allowing the trio the time to get on a boat and make a break for it. However, the Nazis do try to catch up, and it's here where we get the equivalent of a moving turret section. As we uncover that below a fruit basket is a set of rifles, and we use them to shoot the bad guys. Locus does remark that he's choosing the lesser of two evils here, and that's the only reason he's helping them. During this sequence, since reloading isn't an option, you're forced to switch guns, as you evade both the Nazis and the Royal Army. This is around the point where as Indy latches onto a log to keep himself from falling over the small waterfall, after the boat fucks out and he's forced to jump ship, he spots Gina being captured by the Nazis, with Voss again there to taunt Gina, and further instilling the idea that Laura obeyed him willingly. There's no sign of Locus for now, and Gina tries to punch Voss, but is restrained by his goons. She then kicks Voss in the nuts. Hard. And I'm gonna be real, whoever did the sound effect for that really nailed it, because that sounded painful. Voss quickly recovers and insults the deceased Laura in a mocking voice that makes you really hate him for that. To be honest, this is probably one of the best times Voss is good at pushing the player's buttons. This is a time the actor's over-the-top performance works to its greatest effect. Speaking of which, I should say by now that all the actors do a solid job. I really don't like Troy Baker. I think he's overused. His defense for The Last of Us Part 2 was awful and seems to be in every AAA game these days, but his Harrison Ford impression is really good. Not to discount all the other indie voice actors, but I forgot half the time that it was an actor doing an impression. Then there's Alessandra Mastronardi. the Italian actress who plays Gina. Her voice is obviously very accented, but I think she does a decent job with the material. I say that because this is far from the best love interest in an indie game. I much preferred Marion, or even Sophia Hapgood from Fate of Atlantis. The game did seem to localize and get actors who are natively from the region of the characters they played. Then there's Marius Gravilis as Emmerich Voss. He also voiced Voss in the German dub, given this is a German actor, but in general, I think he does a solid job with the material. His persona is that of an exaggerated mind manipulator, and he certainly does come across as convincing in that regard, although sometimes I feel that the script he worked with did call for antics, and the character came across as a bit insane at times. However, I imagine that was what was asked of him, and he fulfilled that role. Then out of the main cast, there's finally the late Tony Todd. Now I noticed this with Ray Stevenson too, but typically you seem to be a little more objective about an actor's performance when the actor themselves passes away. And there's reflection on their career. In relation to Tony Todd, his performance as Locus was pretty good and distinct from all the other characters. He spoke in a way that gave off the impression that he was indeed part of an ancient cult and doesn't have good social skills. And appropriately, alongside Final Destination Bloodlines, this game is dedicated in his memory. So rip Tony Todd. Okay, so as Indy tries to make his way to Gina, Voss can be heard stating that they'll leave the area and lure Indy to the area they're heading to next. This is where Indy and Locus regroup, and it's here where they cease being enemies. Locus shows that he is willing to help Indy save Gina, but states to him that he should not try to follow this journey to the end. So it's here where the two, officially now allies, head to where Voss is heading, which turns out to be Iraq. I also love the final area, where it takes place at night and gives off the appropriate finale vibes. When the pair arrive to the Nazi dig site, and after knocking out one of the guards, they spy on the place from an upper vantage point, where Indy spots Voss lashing out at Gina for giving them a hard time. Indy and Locus formulate a plan. Locus will rally his people to cause a distraction, while Indy seizes the opportunity to get in and get out once he's got Gina, warning him that he should not see what's in store. So with that being said, with the distraction caused, we've got to find our way to Gina. Since I, once again, absolutely suck at sneaking through guarded areas, I died trying to take on 20 guys. Anyways, we find the key to unlock the door to the back room, untie Gina, and naturally, she insists that they go after Voss. Indy naturally rejects the idea, but curiosity overcomes him, and he decides against his better judgment to find out what the Nazis have been digging up all this time. So instead of getting out, they're going down. They sneak into an elevator shaft that takes them down below. There's a bit of problem solving concerning the elevator down to the bottom, but aside from that, we arrive at the lower dig site, and we find out what this was all about. Turns out the thing the Nazis have been trying to power up with all the stones all along was Noah's Ark, presented in all its glory. And that's where I have to stop this review and talk about something really important. This right here, amongst Indiana Jones enthusiasts, has been the topic of debate, because this isn't actually the first time Indy came across Noah's Ark. From what I understand, in the novel Indiana Jones and the Genesis Deluge, Indy encounters Noah's Ark a whole 10 years prior to this game. In 1927, Indy and friends found Noah's Ark in Turkey, and ends up buried under snow at the end. Now we've got Noah's Ark popping up again in Iraq in the Great Circle. And this has caused a lot of discussion about the use of Noah's Ark in the Indiana Jones canon. Some have proposed both can coexist, given Indy in the novel speculated that there might have been multiple Noah's Ark to save numerous ancient people from great floods. And one could make the excuse that this is another Ark from the same legend that appeared elsewhere in the world. However, Indy in the Great Circle makes no mention of encountering a Noah's Ark ship before now. I cannot say much more, as I have not read the novel yet. I only barely finished The Peril of Delphi as of writing this script, and I'll have to see for myself how it's described in the novel, but the point is, there is a loose connection one could make. Apparently, the idea that Indiana Jones encounters the same artifact multiple times has been done before, long before Disney acquired Lucasfilm. It was always hand-waved away as different versions of the same artifact from the original legend. According to someone like Leland Chi when discussing the continuity of all the Indy stories, But as it pertains to the Great Circle, it seems to have outright retconned the Genesis deluge without trying to patch it up. According to the Indiana Jones wiki, apparently MachineGames were aware of this story, as the novel itself could be seen next to the narrative designer in one of the behind-the-scenes videos. So it's probable that they already knew about Noah's Ark already being used for an Indiana Jones story. In my opinion, however, and I know this would probably open a can of worms in the story currently presented, but they probably should have referenced the Genesis deluge and come up with an explanation that the previous Noah's Ark was not the Noah's Ark, but rather an identical ship meant to survive the same great flood told in the legends. Again, I know Indy randomly bringing up a prior adventure not previously known to most people would be confusing, but patching up the plot hole created here is better than nothing. I can easily see Indy in this game mentoring his previous Noah's Ark adventure, which confirms his theory in the Genesis Deluge novel that there may be multiple Noah's Arks. And then you could just say that either ship could have been the Noah's Ark without much problem. I just don't like it when continuity is paved over. And just because Indy's been lax before, doesn't mean MachineGames and Bethesda should have paved over it. I've also heard by extension that apparently, Benito Fascellini appeared in one of the novels too. Indiana Jones and the Mystery of Mount Sinai, this time taking place after the Great Circle, in 1941. However, from what I understand, Indy did not physically encounter Benito Fascellini in that story either. Again, I'm yet to read it, but I just wanted to note that. But the point is, the main story that's been retconned is the former novel. I still don't know why Disney hasn't decanonized the expanded adventures yet, but that's a discussion for another day. Anyways, Indy deduces that the giant ship is Noah's Ark, and that it was deliberately placed here thousands of years ago. What Noah's Ark has to do with the stones, he doesn't know, and he plans to sneak onto the ship. He gives Gina the stones for safekeeping, while he infiltrates the lower camp. This is probably the hardest of all the stealth sections, but skipping over that, when Indy makes it inside the tent and he finds Lucas all knocked out, upon approaching him, Voss holds him at gunpoint and takes his revolver. And it's here where he decides to put the guns down and suggests they have a one-on-one discussing the legend of Noah's Ark. Basically, the great flood myth of different cultures is all based on the same real event, Voss claims. This is probably the demonstration of the fact that Voss somewhat respects Indy, as he proclaims that while Indy found the Ark of the Covenant, he found Noah's Ark. So it's his way of insisting that he's at his level in terms of great discoveries. And I like that, actually. There have been hints throughout the game that Voss sees Indy as more than just useless. And given he's practically one of his evil counterparts, it's a good dynamic. It's very derivative off of the trope of the villain who directly challenges the hero on a personal level, but it's a trope in a story for a reason. I believe Magnus Vola from Staff of Kings also played somewhat of a similar role, but I'm going to be honest, I haven't finished that game yet. Okay, I have played the DS version, but the DS version was basically just a basic outline of the story that game as a whole offered. With that being said, Voss invites Indy to tell him a story that he hasn't heard, based on Voss's discovery in North Africa that an angel who was the voice of God gave a mortal man, let's call him Noah, the means to make a giant vessel, giving him 17 stones in the process to be able to travel across the earth. Voss mentions that the Nephilim Order by extension were blamed for the great flood happening in the first place, and so they desired redemption for their sins, which is why Lucas was so dead set on righting the wrongs of his ancestors. You can actually hear Voss's genuine fascination with the legend he's uncovered, and this is probably the character at his best actually. Good thing too, because we're literally at the end stage of the game. He actually manages to get to Indy with this grand story he's uncovered, and then he changes the subject by asking Indy where Gina is. Indy lies that she's long gone, and Voss remarks that it's a shame, because he got a final recording from Gina's sister that she'd like to hear. As it turns out, Laura was fully opposed to the Nazis and preferred to freeze to death in the Himalayas, rather than give Voss the stone. Gina comes in, grabbing Voss's gun, overhearing the final recording from her sister, and she tries to shoot Voss in the face, although turns out the gun wasn't loaded. Yeah, she probably should have picked up Indy's revolver instead, although I wouldn't call this a contrivance. Because as it turns out, Voss had his goons on alert, and ready to signal them in case something went wrong. So he was far from harm's way any way you slice it. Point is, he's fooled both Indy and Gina yet again, and has them both restrained. The Nazis retrieve the stones off Gina, and now the set is complete. All 17 stones are in the bad guy's possession. And it's right here where Indy tries one final hand at warning Voss about the power being beyond his control. Although Voss simply remarks that he's always in control. Yeah, I think that arrogance is going to catch up to him. But regardless, he has Indy knocked out. Presumably the next morning, the Nazis finish pulling Noah's Ark out of the dig site and bring it into the water to the nearby Lake Hamar. The good guys, including Indy, Gina and Lucas, are left tied up, forced to witness Voss put all the stones in. Turns out Noah's Ark 2 already had the last stone inserted into the wheel. Voss basically monologues his evil plan to basically win the upcoming world war by teleporting to any location he wants through Noah's Ark. With one stone, teleportation is extremely unpredictable, but with all 17 stones, he can go precisely wherever he wants. He proposes the idea of landing the Nazis in the middle of Times Square, Washington DC, or even the university Indy worked at. It would basically solve the problem of bypassing the US Navy. If you can ambush them from within, cut off the head of American leadership before they ever become a threat, and not gonna lie, I can see why Voss invested so much into this plan. This would probably be one of the most useful MacGuffins in the series. Lucas is stuck chanting about 17 stones, 17 words, while Voss dramatically inserts all 17 stones in order, while speaking their words in Adamic. Indy and Gina signal to each other a means to escape by using her hairpin to cut the ropes and escape, and during all this, Indy blurts out that Noah was chosen by God, and so using the stones is a bad idea, given Voss would not be deemed worthy by God. Voss ignores him and continues the cycle until he gets to the All-Maker stone and cries out the final word, but then nothing happens. And Indy is left laughing, mockingly asking Voss what he thought would happen. But then rain starts dropping, and the wheel bursts with energy, knocking Voss back, and that's where you know the thing has worked, for better or for worse. Voss seems to have reenacted the Great Flood, and now everything is getting windy and rainy, and it's a total nightmare. Voss, realizing things aren't happening the way he wanted it to, pins the blame on Indy for sabotaging his experiment. It's here where the trio all officially unbind, and Lucas tries to get to Voss, but he's shot numerous times and collapses. It's from here that we take on Voss ourselves. Yeah, the final boss in other words. Now earlier, Voss proclaimed himself a master of karate, and it's this gimmick he uses to fight Indy. I should also note that this time, Voss possesses the whip, not Indy. This fight isn't really hard, it's mostly just a one-on-one climax full of spectacle and heated dialogue between the two on whose fault it is for the Great Flood coming back. After doing enough damage, Voss uses the whip to restrain Indy, at least until a wave comes by that knocks everyone down. At first it appears that Voss has been washed away, until Voss grabs the whip still tied to one of Indy's hands, and drags him down with him to the side of Noah's Ark, in which the pair try to kick each other off. Eventually, when Gina is done with Voss's sidekick Bergman, she offers a hand to Indy, and saves him from being washed out the side. Voss still manages to climb up, however, and this is where things finally catch up to Voss. Lucas manages to get up from his gunshot wounds and places his hands on the steering wheel, trying to direction Noah's Ark towards an uncertain location. He tells Lucas to move off the wheel, and Lucas in turn warns him to move, twice. When Voss refuses to move out of the way, he finds out the hard way why that was a bad judgment call, as a burst of energy shoots from the steering wheel, bursting through Voss's chest and burning his whole body, killing him. We see his fizzled corpse collapse to the ground, as Lucas then warns Indy and Gina to leave the Ark right now. The pair oblige and jump for their lives, just as Lucas continues steering the Ark right into a portal that appears, and for the first and last time in this story, Lucas smiles, the sort of smile that indicates that he has set things right, as the Ark heads towards the portal and disappears through it. In the aftermath, Indy and Gina make it across the shore to safety and contemplate on what they just saw. Lucas's fate is left unknown, but all they can say is that Lucas proved himself worthy in the end. Indy collects his hat, and it's on to the final scene. The pair reflect on their journey, and this is where Gina opts to say goodbye. Indy gives Gina her late sister's journal, and while Indy offers Gina to stick around, she declines, but does warm the moment by saying that as a journalist, she has a hell of a story to tell, and Indy will be too busy chasing the past. She is about to leave on a plane, but then she decides to kiss Indy last minute and tells him to find her when this is all over. I presume she's talking about the upcoming war. Then she gets on the plane, and that's the end of the game. Gina flies off and the credits roll, leaving Indy sort of in his starting position for Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And it does blend nicely, as now he's got to resolve things with his father the following year. So with that being said, that's the main campaign of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. While I'd say at times it can be a mixed bag with questionable writing, a questionable core first-person gameplay design, and some moments that didn't feel quite up to snuff, this was actually a pretty decent game. But I will say it will need some vast improvements if they're ever to make another one. I understand there was the idea to make this more like a first-person adventure game and less like Tomb Raider and Uncharted, and it was an ambitious deviation of an idea from what you'd expect, but it is rough around the edges often. If I had to be constructive and talk about improvements they could make, I'd suggest improvements to combat and navigation, as while they certainly do their job, they could be vastly improved. As for secondary suggestions, I'm thinking that maybe they could not make the Nazis the bad guys again in the next game. It's not an absolute requirement, but Diarrhea of Destiny gave me a Nazi fatigue. Only one original story Indiana Jones game takes place outside the age of the Nazis, and that's the Infernal Machine. The rest have Nazis as secondary antagonists at the very least, and I'd like some variety. If their excuse was that they wanted to play it safe while they were dipping their toes into an ambitious game, sure, whatever. I can accept that. But now that you've gotten conflicting feedback on this game, it's time you experiment and try new things. Now that you've got your successful formula established, I expect the next game to try and be more like, I don't know, for example, Mass Effect 2, which objectively improved a successful formula and disregarded the parts that people didn't like. I'd like whatever comes next to be sort of like that, although obviously based on the kind of game Indiana Jones is and not a role-playing game. Although that idea is interesting to say the least. I was actually considering making a game based on Indiana Jones and the Fallout 2 engine, because I'm trying to learn modding for that game, but that's a story for another time. Point is, that's my personal recommendation for the next game, as well as things I expect MachineGames to do if they're going to make a sequel. Although obviously, I think we should get Wolfenstein 3 first. Seems only fair if they took a break to do Indy. Let our other favorite fascist-hating action hero finish off the Nazis for good. So that aside, I'm going to give Indiana Jones and the Great Circle a 7.5 out of 10. But I will caution that if you play it on too casual a level and just rush through the main story, you probably aren't gonna like it. This is not a game you can rush through to have a good time. So that's my review of the main game. Now I wanted to talk about one more thing before we wrap up, the secret ending. Turns out that in order to complete the story as a whole, you need to do the secret ending by collecting relics in all the locations you visited. Backtracking to get all this crap wasn't simple or easy, and I hated it. I also looked up how to do the final puzzle because I was once again very lazy. And finally I got the secret ending. And it was not worth the effort. All it does is reveal that the Ark found its way to Antarctica, and that Lucas probably survived, given footsteps can be seen. Unfortunately, as Tony Todd's final role, the door will have to be left open on his character's final fate. So the secret ending is disappointing to say the least, and it doesn't give you a super cool reward. It just gives you a little bit of a tease on what happened to Lucas after he went through the portal. Either way, that's the secret ending. So with this review properly completed, I want to conclude by saying that Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is a solid, however rocky foundation for a potential set of games to come out after it. Hopefully MachineGames drastically improves the game design so we can get an even better game. From the fallout concerning Diarrhea of Destiny, I went into this with troubled expectations, but needless to say, it's a serviceable Indiana Jones experience, and maybe I'll talk about Order of the Giants and some of the side content another time. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain.